Hello, my name is Mark Rubin from the University of Newcastle, based in the School of Psychology, and I'd like to talk to you today about some research that I conducted with my colleagues Milan Milanov and Stefania Paolini, looking at diverse cultural bases of social identity. And we'd like to thank the John and Daphne Keats Endowment Research Fund for their funding of this research. So we're going to be talking about self-stereotyping, and so it's worth examining exactly what that is, and who better to talk about that than Agent Smith from The Matrix, and there he is, all of him, in his many different bodies. So self-stereotyping involves the perception of similarities between the self and in-group members. So as you can imagine, Agent Smith here from The Matrix will feel quite similar to the other members of his group, at least in terms of physical appearance. And the concept of self-stereotyping is important because it's central to a mainstream explanation of group processes called self-categorization theory. And according to self-categorization theory, self-stereotyping follows a process of depersonalization in which people no longer perceive themselves as unique, idiosyncratic individuals who are different from one another, or their personal identity, but as interchangeable, stereotypical group members who are similar to one another, or what is called their social identity. So this process of depersonalization is thought to underpin a diverse range of group phenomena, including prejudice, stereotyping, conformity, group polarization, group cohesiveness, crowd behavior, and leadership. And the idea basically is that the more similar you feel, the more you stereotype yourself towards other people in the group, the more you are likely to behave in a way that is consistent with the group norms and engage in these different forms of behavior. And the question we were interested in is what predicts self-stereotyping? So self-stereotyping then is something which signifies that social identity is in action. If you feel similar to other people in your group, then social identity is salient. If you don't feel similar, if you feel like an odd person out in your group, then you're really not identifying with that group and you're unlikely to show this host of different behaviours. You're unlikely to be prejudiced in favour of your group and show leadership and so on. So the question that we wanted to address is, well, what is responsible for you feeling similar? On what dimensions do you feel similar? Why do you feel similar to other people in your group? And we looked at one of the potential explanations for this based on self-categorization theory, which was the underpinning theory here. So we looked at the theory, and in Turner's book about the theory, he explained that self-stereotyping can be based on any variable such as common fate, shared threat, proximity, similarity, shared interests, cooperative interaction, positive interdependence, anything that can function cognitively as a criteria of social categorization to produce an awareness of social identity. So you can feel similar to one another based on a large variety of different dimensions. You might be all in the same room all together, proximity, and that provides this sense of similarity, where we're all similar because we're all here. You might have the same shared interests. You're all fishing fanatics or something, and that provides a sense of identity, a sense of similarity which you share with one another. Now, one of the things that is not necessarily listed here but could also play a role here is in-group ties or feelings of closeness to other in-group members. That may also have the potential to act as the basis for self-stereotyping. And in fact, there is already some evidence that that is the case. In other words, as close interpersonal bonds with other people become more salient, they are likely to act as the cognitive basis for a shared social identity and lead to a relatively high degree of perceived similarity between the self and other in-group members. So I feel similar to you in terms of the closeness that we have for one another. That then provides a basis for my self-stereotyping and consequently my social identification. In the present research, what we wanted to do was to consider whether there are cross-cultural differences in the extent to which in-group ties might predict self-stereotyping. So again, we looked around, we tried to figure out why there might be a moderating effect of culture on the relationship between in-group ties and self-stereotyping. So the relationship between in-group ties and self-stereotyping would be this. It would be that the stronger you feel your in-group ties, then the more similar you feel, the more you stereotype yourself as a member of the group. The more mateship you feel, if you like, within your group, the closer you feel to the people in your group, the more you stereotype yourself on that dimension and feel, right, this is part of my identity, I believe in this group. And the question we were asking then is, well, if there's a positive relationship between in-group ties and self-stereotyping, does that positive relationship exist for all different types of cultures? And the answer again comes from self-categorization theory, which predicts that self-stereotyping is more likely to occur when the prospective category criterion is subjectively important and accessible. And based on that reasoning, we hypothesized that in-group ties would be more likely to act as a cognitive criterion for category membership in cultures that place greater importance on this aspect of social groups. So which cultures then place more importance on in-group ties? And the answer to that question comes from a meta-analysis by Oyserman and colleagues, and also by from research from Triandus. So this research indicates that individualist cultures place greater importance on in-group ties than collectivist cultures. For example, Triandus and colleagues found that Americans placed more importance than the Chinese on the interpersonal values of true friendship and loyalty. Now, I realise that sounds a little bit counterintuitive because I'm saying to you, individualists place more importance on in-group ties than collectivists. That's a bit weird, isn't it? Shouldn't it be collectivists that value the group more than individualists? And the answer is, well, not really, when you consider that individualists are focusing on interpersonal relations between people within a group, and not really focusing on intergroup relations, which is what collectivists were focusing on. So collectivists might say it's us and them, and that's what the evidence shows, that collectivists are more concerned about groups and more concerned about how groups relate to one another. Whereas individualists will look inside their group and say, well, it's us and how we relate to one another, true friendship, loyalty, and so on. So individualists are concerned, if you like, about the intra-group processes, and collectivists are more concerned about the intergroup processes. So on that basis, we predicted that in-group ties should be a stronger predictor of social identity and self-stereotyping in individualistic cultures than in collectivist cultures, because they're more important in individualistic cultures. So we conducted a couple of studies to test that idea. Study 1 set out to test it using domestic and international students based at the University of Newcastle. But we needed to find a way to distinguish between individualists and collectivists in our sample. And like I say, in Oyserman's meta-analysis, they basically show how you can do that. They found that people from English-speaking countries are more individualistic and more relational and less collectivist than people from non-English speaking countries. And based on those findings, we categorised participants as individualists if they were nationals of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK and the USA, or white South Africa, in other words, English-speaking countries, and collectivists if they were nationals of non-English speaking countries. So just to give you an idea, our collectivist participants included Chinese, Filipinos, Singaporeans, Malaysians, Bangladeshis, Indonesians, and so on. And our participants completed a survey titled Group Identification, and at the start of the questionnaire they considered their family and friends as part of their in-group. They were asked to think about their family and friends and say, think about this group of people. They then responded to items that assessed their in-group ties and self-stereotyping, and at the end of the questionnaire they indicated their age, gender and nationality. So here's our measure of in-group ties. You can see how it's sort of measuring this construct. It's a 3-item measure. It's loosely based on a measure by Cameron, 2004, and as you can see, the items refer to the relationships that people have with other people inside their group. Now, the Cronbach alpha for this, the internal measure of internal reliability, was only 0.61, which is not great. Certainly be frowned on by hardliners, but we believe it was okay for a small 3-item scale like this. We also included a measure of self-stereotyping. This had a good internal reliability of an alpha of 0.77. And you can see this is all about the similarity that people feel with other people in their group. I feel similar, I feel different, so on. And the results here, well, our individualist sample contained 54 women and our collectivist sample contained 76 women, and those percentages were significantly different from one another. In addition, our individualists were significantly younger than our collectivists, so we included gender and age as control variables in our analysis in order to control for their confounding influence. And we conducted a hierarchical multiple regression analysis in which we regressed self-stereotyping onto gender and age in step 1, culture and in-group ties in step 2, and the culture by in-group ties interaction term in step 3. And it was that interaction term that we were particularly interested. We wanted to see whether culture moderated or interacted with the effect of in-group ties on self-stereotyping. And the only significant effect was for that interaction term. Consistent with predictions, the relationship between in-group ties and self-stereotyping was stronger among individualists than among collectivists. Indeed, it was non-significant among collectivists, as you can see at the bottom here. So study 1 provided initial support for our hypothesis. However, it did have a number of limitations. Study 1's sample of individualists mainly consisted of Australian students. In order to confirm that our results were not limited to this particular individualist country, we recruited individualist participants from other English-speaking countries in Study 2. Study 1's sample of collectivists mainly consisted of international students who were studying in Australia, and the separation of those students from their home countries may have affected the relationship between their interpersonal ties with their family and friends and their self-stereotyping. And again, in order to eliminate that confound between migrant status and culture, we recruited more participants from their native countries in Study 2, and we controlled for migrant status in our cross-cultural analysis. And finally, Study 1 only tested our hypothesis in relation to a small and intimate social group, which was people's family and friends. So our results might be limited to that particular type of group. And in order to test the generalization of our effects in Study 2, we asked some participants to consider their membership in an intimacy group, just like Study 1, which was friends, but also in a task group, which was their work group, and also in a social category, which we chose to be gender. So participants in this study, 102 participants, we had 62 individualists and 42 collectivists, 104 participants, that adds up. And in contrast to Study 1, most of our individualists came from the USA rather than Australia, and most of our collectivists were non-migrants. Our individualist and collectivist samples were similar in terms of their gender and age, but significantly different in terms of their social class and migrant status. Consequently, we controlled for social class and migrant status in our cross-cultural analysis. And to test the generality of our effects, we randomly assigned participants to consider one of 3 different types of social group. 35 participants considered an intimacy group, which was friends. 35 considered a task group, which was people you work with. And 34 considered a social category, which was their gender. The results, well, consistent with Study 1, in-group ties interacted with culture to predict self-stereotyping. The relation between in-group ties and self-stereotyping was significantly stronger amongst individualists than amongst collectivists, where it was non-significant. Note that the 3-way interaction between culture, in-group ties and group type was not significant. Hence, the 2-way interaction between culture and in-group ties did not vary significantly as a function of group type, and we can then sort of confirm that this was a fairly general effect. So in summary then, in 2 studies we found that self-stereotyping was predicted by a significant interaction between participants' culture and their in-group ties. Among individualists, having close, empathic and meaningful relationships with other in-group members was positively related to perceptions of similarity with those in-group members. Among collectivists, this relationship was significantly weaker and non-significant. And this pattern of results held across 2 different samples of individualists and collectivists, and 3 different types of social group. In particular, it didn't matter whether individualists were represented by mostly Australians in Study 1 or North Americans in Study 2, and it didn't matter whether collectivists were represented by mostly international students studying in Australia in Study 1 or members of the global internet community in Study 2. And finally, Study 2 found that it didn't matter whether participants responded with respect to an intimacy group, friends and family, a task group, a work group, or a social category, which was gender. The conclusion from all of this is we think that our results show that people from different types of culture, individualist and collectivist, tend to use different types of cognitive criteria as the basis for establishing their social identities. In particular, in-group ties are more likely to form the basis for social identity in individualistic cultures than in collectivist cultures. But we are left with some questions for future research. So although in-group ties emerged as a relatively strong basis for self-stereotyping among individualists, the basis for self-stereotyping amongst collectivists was unclear. Note that we found no difference in the amount of self-stereotyping between individualists and collectivists. So collectivists did have a depersonalized social identity just as much as individualists. The big question is why? All we know at this stage is that it was not because they felt close to the other members of their group. So the key question for future research is what drives self-stereotyping amongst collectivists. If anyone has any ideas about this, I'd be interested to hear about them. Thanks very much. Hello again. I just wanted to let you know about a research website that is available, which provides more information about my research. I talk about not only the things that I've talked about today, but also other research projects that are going on and have been completed. So I do a lot of stuff about social class as well. And you can also find out about how to apply for a PhD and how to apply for scholarships if you would like to join me in investigating the sorts of things that I've talked about today. So please feel welcome. I'll get rid of my face and you can have a look at the link there. You can freeze the frame and copy that down and go and visit that website and find out more about me and my work. Thank you very much.